Hello and welcome to week 8 of plant biology here at NICC. This week our reading comes back to the biology 2E textbook, so we're no longer in concepts of biology, we're back to 2E. And this week our reading is only one section of one chapter, but it's pretty lengthy and there's a lot of jargon and technical terms in this chapter, so spend some extra time reading through this chapter maybe a couple of times and work through some of this information. So we're going to be reading in chapter 30.6, so 30.6 of the Biology 2E textbook, and this is covering plant sensory systems and responses. So this week we're talking about how plants sort of sense the world around them, and then how do they respond to what they sense in the world around them. One of the major environmental constraints that plants sort of listen to or pay attention to is light. And that shouldn't be surprising after our readings from last week where we talk about photosynthesis. Hopefully you have a good understanding that photosynthesis is really the process that's driving the energy production for plants. And so, since photosynthesis requires light, they definitely need ways in which to respond to light to maximize their photosynthetic responses. They do this in a number of different ways. They use what's called photoperiodism, where they're keeping track of time, and phototropism, where they're moving either towards or away light, photomorphogenesis, where they grow and develop in a direction in response to light. So plants really respond strongly and in a few different ways to light as a stimulus. When we're talking about these light sensing responses in plants, we're going to start out in this section of reading talking about the phytochrome system. And really, the long and the short of the phytochrome system is that this is a way that plants have adapted to move their growth away from darkness and towards light. And since competition for light resources is something that plants do all the time with other plants, this is an important adaptation that plants have evolved to really maximize their exposure to light, and not surprisingly, since they use light to build their food resources, this makes them more competitive with their neighbors. Plants also use this phytochrome system to determine whether it's a good time for the seeds to germinate or not. That's important if it's too dark, so if the seed is buried too deep, it won't germinate. It'll wait until conditions are better. Also, plants use this phytochrome system to determine the season. So just because the temperature outside is warm or cold doesn't necessarily mean that the plant should start making preparations for fall or spring, regardless of what the weather is. They're using this phytochrome system to sense daylight time, which is consistent with the seasons, to better prepare themselves for whatever season is coming ahead. If an oak tree has a cold day in early September and then drops all its leaves, then it's missing out on a significant portion of the growing season, especially at the end of the season, to grow and develop. So that those few early cold days may not push that maturation in the same way that a very warm spot in the spring will not push trees necessarily to start budding out early. They'll sort of pump those brakes and be a little more patient in their response so that they don't leaf out too early and then get smashed by what we have pretty commonly, where we have cold weather that follows these earlier spring thaws. So plants use this phytochrome system to judge what time of year it is so that they can be well prepared to start any physiological or anatomical processes that they need to respond to the seasons. Plants also respond to light in sort of shorter term ways as well, and these are called phototropic responses or phototropism. And plants will usually grow, at least the shoot part of plants will usually grow in a positive phototropic way where they're moving towards light, which again makes sense. Plants want to move those green photosynthetic parts closer to the light source. And oftentimes you'll have the roots actually exhibiting a negative phototropic response where they're growing down into the soil. And again, that shouldn't be surprising. But plants are responding sort of in the short term as well to these light sorts of stimuli. Also shouldn't be too surprising that plants respond to gravity. Humans respond to gravity. I think most organisms, especially ones that live on land, have some sort of gravity sort of response. Our upright posture and development of our musculature is really devoted to fighting against gravity, and plants fight against gravity as well. Gravity is always pulling them down towards the center of the earth, and they want to grow up into the sunlight, closer to those light resources. And so most parts of plants, at least the shoots anyways, again, have this negative gravitropic response where their shoots are trying to grow up and away from gravity. But again, we get the roots, which will grow down with gravity. Again, this makes a fair bit of intuitive sense, but I think a lot of times until we think about it specifically, these sorts of tropic responses in plants are usually kind of taken for granted, that roots just grow down and shoot parts grow up. But this is in response to a very specific chemical sort of and physical signal that's telling the plant which way is up. So they have these sort of sensory capacities to understand which way is up, which way is down, and what parts of my body need to grow in these separate ways to maximize my chance of survival given these conditions. The hormones that plants are utilizing in these growth sorts of responses usually fall into a number of different classes. Very importantly are the auxins. We also have what are called cytokinins and gibberellins. Auxins are the main sorts of hormones that are responsible for cell elongation, and where we have this phototropism and gravitropic response. So auxins are really important in these sort of motion or sensory responses in plants. Gibberellins are really important to encourage shoot elongation and seed germination, fruit and flower maturation. These classes of hormones are really important in the development of, say, fruits and other things like that with plants. The image in the book, figure 30.40, is a picture of grapes, and gibberellic acid sprayed on these grapes encourages stem growth and promotes the growth of these really large grapes, which otherwise would, as they're clustered together, tend to stay a little smaller. So humans can manipulate a plant's response by artificially adding these sorts of hormones to the plants to provoke a specific response. So plant researchers and horticulturists have used these techniques for a very long time to get these sorts of responses that they want from the plants. Abscisic acid, this is another hormone that we see, and it's important in sort of maturation and the dropping of things off of plants, so leaves, cotton, things like that. Ethylene is, you may have heard this when you're looking at overripe bananas at the grocery store. This is a gas that's associated with fruit ripening with plants. There's also a number of sort of non-traditional hormones that go on with plants as well that are much less minor, the jasminates, the oligosaccharides, and the strigolactones that they mentioned in the book. But the ones that they spend more time on are really the big sort of important ones that come up a lot in the research and in the applied fields when we're talking about plant responses to hormones. Plants also respond to, say, wind and touch sensations as well. We don't generally think about plants as responding to touch, but they definitely do. So if you want to make your trees feel good, go outside and hug them. Not really. But they do respond to these sorts of physical sensations. This is known as thigmotropism or some of these words are easy ones to struggle with. Thigmonastic responses or thigmomorphogenesis. These are all different ways that plants are responding to these sorts of touch sorts of sensations. So the wind pushing a tree drives these sorts of responses, and we can see that, at least in this part of Iowa, we sort of have these sort of traditionally seen what are called open-grown oaks. So usually they're bur oaks, and so they'll grow with these really sort of short-ish trunks, but usually big, broad trunks, and the branches grow out very, very broad and wide rather than growing very tall and straight. And so this open-grown morphology is really part of this plant's response to wind. And if these trees are growing out in the open and they're constantly being pushed by these winds moving across the prairie landscape, they grow in these very specific ways. And once you close these trees in, they'll drop their lower limbs and change the way in which they sort of exist in the world. Now, if you clear those back out, if you clear the other trees out from around them, and this tree that was originally open grown and has then dropped its limbs, it'll really suffer and oftentimes dies simply because it's sort of tried to adapt to its new environment, and then the environment changes again and it's not really able to adapt in a meaningful way that allows it to survive in this habitat. So plants definitely respond to these touch sensations. If you think about a grapevine, they have those tendrils that coil along fences or whatever they're growing on. Those are thigmotropic responses. They're growing in response to that pressure that's touching against the part of the plant. So plants have lots and lots of different responses. Plants are also defend themselves against herbivory. So if they don't want to get eaten, plants have invested a lot of time and effort to grow their food resources, and they don't want organisms to eat them. Sometimes, actually, those defense responses are things that we as humans find delicious. So if you think about spicy food, that spicy, that capsaicin in those pepper plants, we sense that as, I shouldn't say we, some humans, myself included, sense that spicy flavor is a positive thing and want to eat more. You certainly know people, though, that are like, spicy food is not for me. That's sort of the usual approach in the animal world. Spicy food, not for me. So these sorts of high flavor sorts of compounds in plants are to reduce herbivory. Caffeine is a plant-derived chemical as well. Most people around the world consume caffeine in some way, shape, or form, at least at some points. That's a plant-derived stimulant. If an animal eats that plant and feels stimulated from it, a lot of times they'll avoid that plant. So there's a number of different plant-derived compounds that have psychotropic or psychogenic sorts of impacts that the plants have developed as strategies to dissuade organisms from eating them. In some cases, humans have adapted these as either, flavorings or sensory enhancement sorts of experiences. Also, things simply as like a stinging nettle, which is this very clear, sharp, unpleasant sort of sensation. These are chemical compounds that really plants are investing in to dissuade organisms from eating them. All right, so this is a pretty lengthy chunk of chapter, but it's a good one because it helps build our understanding of how plants are sort of sensing and interacting with their environments around them, and then maybe even changing behaviors or growth patterns in responses to those stimuli. All right, again, this is chapter 30.6, Plant Sensory Systems and Responses in Biology 2E, and I hope you guys have a great week.